Before we begin, a word about the debate's organization. So each of you, our debaters, will have a maximum of 10 minutes to make your opening statements. So you'll each get a 10-minute opening statement. This will be followed by 2 rounds of rebuttals to allow both speakers to respond to the other's statements. So an opening statement of 10 minutes and then 2 rounds of approximately 5-minute rebuttals. At the end of these rounds, we're going to take questions from the audience, and in the final 10 minutes of the debate, you'll each have 5 minutes to give a closing statement. Any questions? Mr. Hitchens, Dr. Brummett? Okay, I'm going to ask Christopher Hitchens to speak first, if that is okay with you, sir, and then we'll, in the closing statements, have Dr. Brummett speak first. Is that all right with you?
For me, yes, that's fine.
Okay. Well, in that case, Christopher Hitchens, your opening statements, take it away.
Bring it on. Well, first I should congratulate you on your anniversary. And second, thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I was born in Portsmouth, Hampshire, and the little town outside near where we live was called Waterloo. Ville, nice little place if you're in that part of Hampshire. And when I later went to Oxford University, I was kept going in part by a Kitchener scholarship. So it would have been especially nice for me to be with you this evening. Let me see how I want to inaugurate this. I think I'll start in Prague, if I may, a few years ago, where I went in order to meet Václav Havel, Mikhail Baryshnikov, and Larry Flint, the publisher of Hustler, all in the same room at the same time. It's a great story. I'll tell you all of it one day. Prague is a spectacularly beautiful city, as you know. And I remember one evening walking across the Charles Bridge from the castle made famous by Kafka, in the company of Mikhail Baryshnikov and a very beautiful young woman named Carol Blue, famous for her chant, and wishing that Larry Flint could be with us, because otherwise I was so obviously going to be the most ugly feature of the landscape. And it was such a treat that I'd arranged to bring my family along, and my wonderful, tough-minded, secular mother-in-law said to me the next day as we strolled through the gorgeousness of the city, "So, wise guy, how come that all this wonderful architecture and all this beauty and civilization was given to us by people who believed in God?" Very fair question, very searchingly asked. And I thought, well, that's true, that we owe that much. But it's also true that we couldn't have had that art and that architecture without the feudal system, without monarchy, and without theocracy. And who would want to say that it was necessary in order to appreciate culture that we should also revere those progenitors of it? I think you'd have to factor in a couple of other things too, at least a couple of other things. Prague, the old town square, in fact, is the place where Jan Hus, the famous Protestant dissident, was burned alive. The conflicts that were raging about what kind of faith we should be holding in those days led to the 30 Years' War, the most devastating war Europe had then seen. Led to tremendous destruction of culture and civilization in the name of God, and because of faith, as well as, of course, the terrifying loss of life. This has to be, I think, part of the calculus as well. St. Peter's, Rome, for example, actually not my favorite building. I think it's rather oppressive, rather too much designed to show who's boss. It contains some wonderful works of art, but I think it's a bit vulgar in itself. That, by the way, suppose you like it more than I do, does it change your mind to know that it was built by the money raised from a very special sale of indulgences? The horrible and corrupt and superstitious system whereby people who could afford it could pay to have their time in purgatory or possibly in the inferno shortened. By the way, using the same units of time, by years. It was assumed that those measurements would apply in the afterlife as well, in exchange for lavish donations to Holy Mother Church. In the end, that system proved so repulsive that even Christianity had to repudiate it. Now, how can we honestly settle the question could you do without St. Peter's if you knew that there were indulgences at the core of it as a foundation stone of it? Would you, if you knew that, still continue to appreciate it in the same way? Could you have skipped either or skipped both? I suggest these questions are, in fact, probably insoluble, but very well worth discussing if we can do it in a clarifying manner. And I'm going to have to put on my glasses now because I want to read, I don't trust myself to quote it properly, a paragraph from T.S. Eliot's wonderful essay, Christianity and Culture. Just bear with me while I read it to you. It is in Christianity that our arts have developed. It is in Christianity that the laws of Europe, until recently, have been rooted. It is against a background of Christianity that all of our thought has significance. An individual European may not believe that the Christian faith is true, and yet what he says and makes and does will all spring out of his heritage of Christian culture and depend upon that culture for its meaning. I do not believe the culture of Europe could survive the complete disappearance of the Christian faith. And I am convinced of that, not merely because I'm a Christian myself, but as a student of social biology. If Christianity goes, the whole culture goes. I would say that was a pretty fair and eloquent statement of the opposing side to mine in this debate. Again, there's a sense in which that statement's obviously true. None of us can imagine our culture, our heritage, never mind just Europe, North America, and many other places too, without the influence of Christianity or some other monotheism. That's true whether you accept its premises or admire them or not. But it was becoming less true even as Eliot wrote. And it was, if what I said just there wasn't true, we wouldn't in fact have his most wonderful poem, The Wasteland, which, overrated as it is in many ways, brilliantly evokes the despair and fear and trembling and angst that accompanied the terrible trauma inflicted on European civilization by the First World War. Now, if you look up Professor Dermot McCullough's new book, History of Christianity, written by a very sophisticated believer, the best book on the general subject, I must say, I've ever read, highly recommend it. He says that it was actually in 1914 that the idea of Christendom, Christian civilization, which could up till then be unironically used, people would speak of Christendom as a real thing, a living, breathing, cultural, human entity, came to an end because the Christian emperors and kings of Europe went to war with each other and did so in such a barbaric way as to usher in a state of not just total war, but of totalitarian principles in European and global politics. We live, in fact, in the wreckage of what Eliot proposes as true and enduring. And that concept of Christendom is gone. We now use the words the Muslim world as if it meant something. It certainly does mean much more to many Muslims than it would do to refer to Christendom beforehand. Eliot's own life, as a matter of fact, represents an attempt to grapple with this compromise. He solved the question of that crisis, the crisis of civilization post-1918, by joining up in effect with a party, the Action Française at first, and then other groups in Europe that were nostalgic for monarchy, for feudalism, in part for theocracy, for an orderly, organic society. His writing testifies to it. In his notorious lecture at the University of Virginia, After Strange Gods, he says probably a proper culture will just have to do without too many secular Jews. A very blunt statement, very offensive to many of his friends, but very sincerely meant. What he meant was, our faith is becoming compatible with certain kinds of modernity, certain kinds of pluralism. Now, I submit that a religion that has to make that confession in any sense at all, whether remorsefully or whether, as he did, positively, has confessed that it has nothing more to contribute to the cultural argument, has confessed to its exhaustion. So that, however true it may have been that religion was a great contributor to music, to painting, to architecture, we have to be aware of a couple of qualifications and modifications to that. I, as a student of literature, would admit that it's very unlikely that the poetry of George Herbert, the devotional poetry, or the poetry and sonnets and sermons of John Donne could have been written by anyone who was insincere about their faith. I think it's incredibly unlikely. But I can't say that of painters and artists who did the Declaration for Civilization, because we don't know what they really thought. All we can know for certain, excuse me while I take a sip of water, all we can know for certain is that if they didn't make a profession of faith, they wouldn't get the commission. Everybody knew what happened to those who doubted the faith, and the examples of Benjamin Franklin, for example, or James and John Stuart Mill, civilized members of the upper orders in stable and developed societies, chose to conceal their own views of the matter because they thought it was too risky. If they thought that, imagine what it was like in less advanced or more tyrannical countries. And the examples of people having to write in code to get their meaning across, philosophers like Spinoza, for example, permanently aware of how the heavy hand of the secular arm of the Inquisition might fall on them, had to conduct themselves. We have, I think, absolutely no right to forget that, to forget the fact that only one copy of Lucretius's De Rerum Naturam, one of the great contributions to culture and civilization ever made, as well as the first discovery of the atomic theory, very nearly didn't survive the Christian centuries at all. Only one copy, in fact, did make it, helped to inspire people like Galileo, whose fate, of course, stood as a permanent reminder to people of what would happen to them if they didn't appear to be sufficiently devout. So I think if I haven't made that point by now, I'll have failed to make it if I elaborate any further. I think I just want to say, and this should probably be in conclusion, I don't have a stopwatch either, is that we are now in the position that I try to occupy in my little book about the Parthenon. The Parthenon is a building without which I could not do. I don't know about any of you, but if you try and imagine European civilization without that, as Eliot invites us to imagine European civilization without monotheism, it's pretty hard to do. A tremendous work, and involving largely, with some slavery, but not much, largely the work of free citizens, artists and artisans of Athens. Inspired quite clearly by faith. Nobody knows anything about that religion anymore, really. Certainly nobody bothers with those gods. Nobody practices the Eleusinian mysteries. That's all gone. But the tremendous contribution made by it stays with us. So what I think we have to be talking about, Professor Brummett and I, among other things, is one of my favorite words, Hegel's word, Aufhebung, transcendence. How do we, as a civilization and a culture, retain what is of value and of beauty and of instruction in the contributions gifted to us by the past from the years and decades and centuries of faith, while discarding, perfect timing, while discarding the superstition, the theocracy, the censorship, the torture, the intimidation that were just as necessary to that system and just as much part of its legacy to us. Thank you very much.
Mr. Christopher Hitchens, thank you very much for your opening statement. Somewhat creative interpretation of 10 minutes, but not too far off. Nicely done.